Well, if I didn't have to be in front of the room talking, I would never be in a crowded room like this. I want to thank Sister Anne Marie for the nice words and for the hospitality that she and all the other sisters extended me at Studium when I lived and wrote here. John, thank you for your kind words and your support about the book. Harry, thank you for the great job emceeing and your willingness to read an extensive manuscript. Kathy, thank you for your beautiful music today and what you've added to this event. Just wonderful. Kat, when I came into Caribou and said, I'm gonna set up a party, I barely got that out of my mouth, and Kathy said, I'll play at it. I said, what? I haven't even thought where it's going to be and what it's going to be. And she said, no, I'm in, I'm playing at it. And I have to say, even about Harry, he said, I'll carry boxes. What do you need? What do you need? So I want to thank everybody who helped today. Fred, who gave out tickets at the door for my daughter Jenny and son-in-law Chad, and my grandchildren Alex and Ella, who helped many of you at the book sale table. For my daughter Melissa and my son-in-law Chris, Chris has been taking pictures throughout the event, and I appreciate that a lot. Mostly I want to thank all of you who have come here today to support Perfume River Nights. I'm so moved by this. So many people I haven't seen in 16, 17 years and have shown up at this event. I especially want to thank all the veterans who came here today to support Perfume River Nights and the donation of the royalties to the Vietnam Veteran Memorial Fund. I understand how hard it is to be in a crowded room like this, and I understand the difficulty of the topic, and I appreciate the effort. We are brothers. So, Perfume River Nights. This book is for the guys who died beside me. This book is for the 3 million men and women who served in Vietnam. This book is for the 60,000 men and women who died in Vietnam before their dreams or potential was realized. This book is for their families, their friends, their loved ones who still mourn their absence. This book is for those who came of age during the Vietnam era, and for all those who suffered through those difficult years. This book is for you. This is not my story. This is not my book. This is your book. This is your story. Perfume River Nights has its roots in events of 50 years ago. In 1968, 3 months after I turned 18, I was an infantryman in Vietnam. As an infantryman in Vietnam, I carried an M16 fully automatic rifle. I carried 600 rounds of M16 ammunition. I carried 4 to 6 fragmentation grenades, and I carried a LAW, a light anti-tank weapon. And as an 18-year-old infantryman in Vietnam, it was my responsibility to decide when to use those weapons and when not to use those weapons. There was no one next to me saying, Mike, shoot, Mike, don't shoot. I had to make split-second decisions whether to shoot or not shoot, decisions that determined who would live and who would die. As an infantryman in Vietnam, I've run patrols, I've run search and destroy missions, I've been on ambushes, and I've been ambushed. I laid on the ground and in holes with dead men and dying men. I've had men beg me to save them, and I've had men beg me to kill them. And I've killed men. I've killed men. It took a long time before I could admit that to myself, much less stand in front of you today and say that to you. But it's part of who I am, it's part of my history, and it's part of what I brought to my writing of Perfume River Nights. Some of you may recall 1968. In 1968, 17,000 of us were killed in Vietnam. In 1968, nearly 90,000 of us were wounded in Vietnam. In 1968, on average, 2,000 of us were killed or wounded every week. Every week. Every week. That's a small town or a big high school. Lost. Every week. When my time was up, I left, abandoning the dead like others had abandoned me. I came home alone, like most Vietnam veterans. And coming home alone, I had time to think. Mostly I was disoriented and filled with grief. But I had the sense I had experienced something profound and something tragic, and that I had some responsibility to the dead and to the 98% that would never experience anything like that, to tell them the story. And so on that trip home, I promised the guys, I promised the dead, that I would write a story. That was nearly 50 years ago when I made that promise. It took me a long time to get to it. Maybe the story wasn't ready, or I wasn't ready to tell it. I spent those first couple decades fending off Vietnam, trying to survive, trying really to figure out where the guys were and how I could save them. I truly believed if I could just figure out where they were and I could get to them, I could still save them. Part of my fear of starting to write was that I wouldn't write well enough to save the guys. And I was terrified by the idea of digging through the ruins of Vietnam, that digging through it might destroy me. In 2000, everything changed. For the decade before that, the voices of Vietnam had become louder and more demanding for me. It was on a hike with the Jacob Wetterling Foundation in southwestern Colorado that the voices swirled around me, and I knew what I had to do. I knew where the guys were. I knew I had to go back to Vietnam, that the guys were waiting for me. I had to go back to the last place I was alive, to the place I died. And so in 2001 and 2002, I went back to Vietnam, and I went to the mountains, and I visited the guys. And I went and sat beside the Perfume River, and we shared our stories. The Perfume River talked to me. It knew our stories and carried them through time. The Perfume River was us. We bathed in it. We drank in it. We killed in it. We died in it. The Perfume River traveled through that landscape, seeping into the soil, picking up the sediments and carrying them forward. Just as we had moved through that landscape and bled into the soil and sweated into the soil and picked up the sediments and carried them with us. And it was there, visiting with the Perfume River, that the story became clear to me and I knew what I was going to write. And in 2003, I moved back to Vietnam. And I began to write. When I started writing, I moved to the city of Hue, Vietnam, a city that the Perfume River flows through. When I started writing, I had 4 goals in mind. The first goal, of course, was to pay the debt. The second goal was to create a remembrance to the nearly 3 million men and women who served in Vietnam. My third goal was to write honestly and from the heart. That regardless of how painful it would be, I knew that I had to write honestly or the writing would have no value. And so some days, many days, I sat at the computer writing through the tears, and I've never stopped crying over this book yet. My fourth goal, and in some ways maybe the most important one, was to write an engaging story, to provide insights to war and warriors, and to create memorable characters. Characters you would care about, characters you would love, characters you would grieve with and grieve for. When I sat down to write, there were a number of topics I wanted to address. One of those topics was survival. Physical survival, certainly, but also moral survival. How does a soldier survive when they do things against their moral code? How do soldiers survive? I wanted to write about people, 18, 19, 20-year-old young men. I wanted to write about love and hate and loyalty and friendship, the things that drew us together and the things that pulled us apart. And I wanted to write about relationships, not just with each other, but with the enemy, with the terrain, with violence and death and terror and loss. I wanted to write about courage. What is courage? Why are we compelled to prove ourselves? Why is courage so difficult to find? What happens when we fail? What happens when we succeed? I wanted to write about combat in personal, intimate terms. The power of combat, the allure of it. the repulsion of it. I wanted to write about landscapes, the beauty and horror of landscapes, the comfort and the agony of landscapes. I wanted to write about choices. What are the choices we have? How do we make those choices? What are the consequences? What are the consequences of those choices we make? Those split-second decisions to fire or not fire. And I wanted to write about transitions. What happens to young men as we move through violent landscapes? As we immerse ourselves in death, in dying, in killing? How does it change us? So with those things in mind, I started to write. I lived in Way for almost 2 years. I wrote in the mornings, and in the afternoon I took comfort beside the river. Then I moved to Bangkok, and I wrote in Bangkok, and then I moved to southern Thailand and wrote in Krabi, and walked along the Krabi River, and then I went to Nong Khai and wrote there and walked along the Mekong River. And then I came to studio and wrote 3 more years. And when it became clear that it was going to be a book, I knew what I was going to do. I knew this was about remembrance. And the best place for remembrance was through the Vietnam Veteran Memorial Fund, the organization that built the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C., the wall that so many of us have gone to, that so many of us are moved by, the wall that holds our friends out to everyone, that reminds people of the consequences of war, the wall. And to ensure that all the royalties went to the wall, I created the Perfume River Initiative, a nonprofit corporation whose purpose is to promote peace, tolerance, and an understanding of the consequences of war through the support of educational, social, and veterans programs. And I gave the book, the copyright, and all the royalties to that nonprofit to give the funds to the Vietnam Veterans Memorial to remember us and to remember our friends. I suppose I really shouldn't say that I didn't want to do this. I really didn't want to do this. Not this party here. I didn't want to carry the book forward. I wanted to write it. I needed to write it. I needed to pay that debt. But I wished I could have given it to someone else to carry it forward. And in the end, I knew that I had to bring it, that I was the Sherpa to take it up the mountain. And so I invite you to put on your packs, be a Sherpa with me, and carry the book forward. Let me read a small section to you. In this short section, there's three references that I should tell you about beforehand. One is NDP, which is a night defensive position. It's the position soldiers went to at night, usually seeking high ground, and usually we dug in if we could. NVA, which referred to the North Vietnamese Army or to a soldier of the North Vietnamese Army. And the term cherry, which refers to soldiers who hadn't yet experienced combat. Let me read this section for you. April 17th, 1968, Vietnam. It was just another formless mountaintop that would be this night's NDP, an easy climb from a narrow stream-cut valley that they had worked for a few clicks without incident. To Singer, it seemed they were miles from any NVA and had been looking in the wrong place for weeks already. He had just started digging in with little enthusiasm when Sergeant Royce, holding a string of canteens, came up to Tripp, who had just gotten out his entrenching tool. Singer stopped digging to listen. "Send a couple of cherries," Tripp said. "I'm sending you," Sergeant Royce said, his voice rising until it cracked. "What about the hole?" "You can dig in when you get back. Right now, you and Singer go fill canteens." "Damn Army." Tripp threw down his entrenching tool. In the cab, choppers brought the water and cherries pulled the details. Singer stepped from the beginning of the hole and came and took a string of canteens. "No sweat, we got this," Singer said, looking at Tripp. With his M16 in his right hand and canteens in his left, he started back towards the stream. They crossed a short distance back. In truth, he was nearly as irritated as Tripp at being sent out after just starting to dig in. There were no trails, just the occasional boot print, a bent twig from their earlier climb. The descent was easy on gradual slope, and Singer focused all his attention on where he stepped and keeping a straight line, confident Tripp wasn't far behind him. He wanted to do this fast, to get back before it got dark. He would find the stream, fill the canteens, then reverse directions and take a direct course back to the perimeter. It grew darker as he descended. The sun was low behind him and the hill cast a long shadow over the canopy, increasing the dimness in the shallow valley. Franz bent down towards him, like giant hands threatening to grab him. The canteens jangled softly against each other with each step, despite his efforts to keep them still. Singer drew up sharply, halted by the sense that something was wrong. The canteens were quiet. The leaves gave no indication of even the slightest breath of air. The sounds of digging that he heard behind as he first started out were swallowed by the distance and the vegetation. Ahead was a whisper of flowing water. Still, something wasn't right. He turned his head to check with Tripp, but there were only the trees, a weave of limb and branches amidst the shadows. His gaze raced up the slope, searching for Tripp's form beside a tree trunk, a silhouette camouflaged by brush. Nothing. No human form. Not even the soft pad of steps of Tripp catching up. He was utterly alone. A lightness fluttered in his chest, and the vertical lines that held the canopy shifted back and forth, threatening to spin. He blinked and felt the sting of sweat. With care not to lose his orientation of the stream and the direction back to the platoon, he turned in a circle, trying to conjure up Tripp. There were only the shadows and his craving for company. He was drifting in space, untethered to anything. His mouth was just opening when he caught himself, closing it forcefully, biting down so he wouldn't call out. He saw himself tearing uphill with all his energy until he was in the comfort of the company of others, but his legs wouldn't move. Beyond the pounding of his heart was the gurgle of water moving over rocks. He was nearly there. If he went back now, he would only have to return again through even darker shadows. He had his rifle and could do this if he could just control his fear. The water was a welcome sight, swirling about rocks, small patches of white foam bubbling up and quickly being carried away. The bottom was a mosaic of stones, tans and browns set in red clay. It would take just a few minutes to fill the canteens, and then a few minutes more to return to the guys. He slipped up to the stream edge, nearly distracted by the magic of moving water, but then Singer saw him. The canteens clunked and rattled when he dropped them on the rocks. He fumbled to bring up his gun. A few meters down the stream, the man looked up, still holding his hand and something in the water. He lifted his hand to show a canteen encased in dark canvas. Water spilled off the canteen, darkening his sleeve and dribbling back into the stream. He rose slowly from his crouch. His black hair was matted against his head, and his face glistened with water as if he'd just washed it. He wore a dark green uniform of a North Vietnamese soldier and had an olive-colored bandolier hung across his chest. He continued to hold the canteen out, as if to offer a drink. His other hand hung loosely, empty at his side. Singer brought his rifle to his shoulder and sighted down the barrel. A gold tooth sat dully in the man's weak smile. His eyes were dark and soft, like his skin, and grew wider with a silent pleading that Singer clearly heard. Still, he lined the muzzle on the man's chest and felt the smoothness of the trigger on his finger. It would only take a touch. His first kill. The corners of the man's smile sagged, and he stepped back, as though that might make a difference. His head bowed, a greeting or surrender to his fate. You'll find out what happens when you read the book. Damn, huh? Wow. Well, let's take a breath, man. Holy crap. Wow, that was like charging a hill, huh? Wow. We made it to the top, and there's no resistance, so we can dig in and hold on, huh? So if you have any questions, I'm happy to try to answer any questions you might have at this point. I would also say that if you belong to a book club or a discussion group or a classroom and you want to read the book and take it on, I will come and discuss the book with you. I make that offer to you. Just contact me through my webpage. So, are there any questions at all? Yes?
This is a stupid question.
There are none.
Why did you name it Perfume River?
It just seemed like the river flowed through the book, like it flowed through the terrain, and that we were often along tributaries of the river, somehow connected through it, that we had crossed the river. And so Perfume River, the Perfume River flows through Hue, Vietnam. So it comes out, that's the name of the river.
Okay.
It flows through Hue, it comes out of the mountains, and it flows through areas that I fought in, and it flows through the book, it flows through us, it carries me. I am the river. Yes?
A question you do not have to answer, but when you read the book, there is such a feeling of connection and tenderness And yet, with this man who's about to perhaps shoot someone, there's also a hardness. As you went through these years, especially in Vietnam, which of those stood out? Was it softening into acceptance or hardening? Do you want to share? You don't have to.
Well, it will be interesting after you read the book what journey you see the characters in. But I think there's certainly a hardening. No one lives through the infantry in combat without hardening. Audie Murphy of World War II fame, the most decorated American soldier out of World War II, was once asked by a soldier, or by a reporter. The reporter said to him, "How do soldiers survive combat?" And Audie Murphy, the most decorated man, said, "Soldiers don't survive. Soldiers don't survive."
At 18, what were your thoughts about college and a deferment possibility?
Do I have a chance to do a do-over? That's an interesting question. Those of us who grew up in that era understand the social influences of that time, that we all grew up with World War II parents, that our fathers and uncles had all served in World War II. It was the Great War. They were the saviors of the world. That was their war. This was ours. There was this rabid anti-communism coming out of the 50s and McCarthyism. There was President John F. Kennedy petitioning us to that sense of duty. Ask not what your country can do for you, but ask what you can do for your country. And so I think there was this pervasive sense of responsibility that was passed on through those social influences. And in fact, the rate of volunteerism in Vietnam was higher than World War II. And the draft hung over all of us and infected all of our lives. Because I went in the military at 17, I never got a draft number, so I never applied for the draft. But everyone who went through that era, you talk to any male, any man who went through that era, and he'll tell you your draft number. He'll tell you what his draft number was. He remembers it. And women remember their brother's draft number or their boyfriend's draft number. We were all affected by that time. And I think in some sense it was, if you were subject to the draft, there was that sense of do it now, go now, be done with your service, then go to college, come out of college, and be drafted after college. And so it was those kind of choices. So, yeah. Yes.
As you know,
Hi.
we were friends back
Thanks
then.
for coming here today. Nice
And
to see you.
I agree with everything that you said. Mike was so excited to serve his country.
Well, yeah, it's kind of, it's interesting to say, well, there were so many different influences. My father, who died when I was 9, was a paratrooper. That's all I know about his military service. All his friends were Marines. His friends who looked after me in the years after he was gone, were all Marines. I have a today they would call it young adult book. It's probably even lower than young adult. It's about a children's book. It's about paratroopers, being a paratrooper. I also have a novel called Devils in Baggy Pants about the 82nd Airborne Division in World War II that was, I don't know, maybe written in the 50s. And I had those things, and I've been so worried about, I thought one of the contests we should have today is how many names Michael forgets and how he frees up on. And I thought, I started seeing all these people and, what's my name? but so I found my old yearbook from 1967. Joe and I went to high school together. And I thought I should look through the yearbook quickly. And it was kind of interesting. I wanted to look at the faces, but then I found a lot of cute notes from someone I used to go with. Got kind of distracted on it. But people already knew I was going into the paratroopers. In fact, some people recognized that in their comment. Good luck in the paratroopers. And so apparently that was a really compelling thing for me in high school for all different kinds of motivations that I don't care to explore. And I don't care to ask John to explore either. So we just leave those unanswered. But thanks, Joe. I appreciate the comment. So, anybody else, any questions or comments? Yes.
We need to get more books after today. Where would we find them?
Oh, thanks. I appreciate you asking that. The books are going to be available in a couple weeks by June 8th from every bookseller. From every independent bookseller as well as the big chain stores and the online sites. Right now, you're getting one of the first copies of the book. The only other place they're available is from the publisher's website, North Star Press. And if you go to that website, you can order one of the books and you can get a signed book from that website by choosing that option. But in 2 weeks, about the time you finish reading the book you bought today, and you're thinking, holy shit, I want my brother to read this, or my friend should read this. About that time, the book will be available everywhere. So this is kind of a pre-release party, really not a release party, but so watch for it in about 2 weeks. And it's who doesn't love going into bookstores? Jesus. Man, next to coffee shops, they're my favorite place. Right? Huh? I just gotta run. I've been asked to leave a couple. You're fondling the books again, please. No. You just run around the shelves and just touch. No, there's nothing like holding a book and flipping the pages and the smell of paper. And so you go in your bookshop, and if you can't find it, ask them to order it for you. Ask them to order it for you. So, yeah, watch for it, okay? It's, the guys gave us this book, and it's our responsibility now to carry it forward. The book is here. They can't do any more. It's our job. Carry it forward.